Before I read the contents of this will, I want to confirm one thing. Is Somi present in this room?
Yes, sir. I am here. I am present.
Good. Chief Obi was very specific about that. He said if she is not in the room, we stop and we reschedule.
He said she is the only one who has earned the right to hear this first.
The room went very still. 43 members of the Obi family, spread across 3 generations, turned to look at the woman standing near the back wall, the one who had been quietly offered the last chair in the room by a cousin who did not even look at her while doing it. The same woman they had spent 11 years treating as furniture. The same woman who had spent the last 14 months sleeping in a hospital chair so an old man she loved would not wake up alone in the dark. 11 years earlier, in a ceremony the Obi family had attended with the particular reluctant dignity of people who have decided to accept something they cannot prevent, a young woman named Somi had married their second son, Kenna, and the family had made their feelings known, quietly but thoroughly, from that very first day. The Obi family of Enugu were the kind of family that measured people the way jewelers measure stones, by cut, clarity, and origin. Chief Obi had built a construction empire across 3 states over 40 years, and by the time his sons were adults, the family name carried enough weight that the manner in which it was attached to other names mattered enormously to everyone who carried it. Somi came from a secondary school teacher's family in a small town outside Enugu, the kind of background that the Obi family's oldest women described, in voices just low enough to seem private, as ordinary. She was educated, well-spoken, and deeply in love with Kenna, none of which the family disputed, and none of which they considered remotely sufficient. Kenna's older brother Dubem had married the daughter of a senator. His younger sister Chisom had married into a Lagos banking family. The family's position on what constituted an appropriate match had never been stated as a formal rule because it had never needed to be. Everyone who approached the Obi name understood instinctively what it required of them. Somi had not understood this quickly enough, or perhaps had understood it and married Kenna anyway, which the family found, in its own way, even more troubling. The cruelty that followed the wedding was not the shouting kind. The Obi family was far too composed for that. It was the kind that arrived in the texture of every gathering, in the seating arrangements at Christmas, where Somi consistently found herself at the farthest end of the table from the family's center, in the way her contributions to conversations were received with a brief acknowledging nod and then efficiently bypassed, in the way her name was rarely used by the older women who preferred instead to call her Kenna's wife, a label that managed simultaneously to acknowledge her existence and deny her any independent standing within it. There was a naming ceremony for Ada's 3rd child. A gathering of nearly 100 people in the Obi compound, where Somi arrived carrying a carefully wrapped gift and a dish she had spent 2 days preparing, and was received by Ada at the entrance with a smile so practiced it had long since stopped carrying any actual warmth. She was directed to help the hired caterers arrange plates in the kitchen, a task no other family member was asked to perform. And she did it quietly, without complaint, and spent the better part of the afternoon moving between the kitchen and the garden, carrying food she had not been invited to eat at the family table. Kenna, when she mentioned it to him that evening, said that she was being too sensitive, that his family simply had their ways, that she needed to give them more time. She had been giving them more time for 4 years at that point. Chief Obi was 73 the year Somi entered the family, a man who had spent 4 decades building something real from very little, and had developed in the process an accurate eye for the difference between people who worked and people who performed the appearance of work. He watched his new daughter-in-law at that first Christmas, the way she helped clear the table without being asked, The way she listened to his stories from his early business years with genuine attention, while his own children glanced at their phones. The way she remembered, 3 months later at Easter, a small detail he had mentioned in passing about a bridge his company had built in 1987, and asked him how the project had actually ended. He looked at her carefully when she asked the question, the way he had once looked at junior contractors who showed up having actually read the documents, and decided then and there that this one was worth knowing properly. Over the following years, while the rest of the family continued their careful indifference, Chief Obi began asking specifically for Somi when he wanted company for his evening walk, or someone to sit with him on the veranda while he read, or a conversation partner who would actually engage with what he said rather than simply waiting for her own turn to speak. The family noticed. They said nothing directly, but the noticing was visible in the particular way people notice a thing they have decided not to acknowledge, through its very careful absence from every conversation. Somi never used the old man's affection strategically. She sat with him because she genuinely enjoyed his company, because he was funny in the dry way of men who had seen enough of the world to find most of it slightly absurd, because he talked to her as though her opinions on things were worth hearing, something she had not experienced often enough inside that family to take for granted. Chief Obi's health began declining seriously in his 79th year. The initial diagnosis, a combination of complications the doctors listed in careful clinical language that amounted to a body beginning its long, unhurried resignation, brought the family together in ways it never was in health. What it revealed, in the process, was not entirely flattering. Dubem, the eldest, arrived from Lagos to consult with the doctors and spent most of his visit on his phone, managing a construction tender that could not wait. He came to the hospital twice, in the first month before the distance and urgency of his own affairs became a reason not to come more often. His wife sent a hamper of imported biscuits and a card, signed by the whole family. Chisom flew in from London for 1 week, wept visibly and photographically at the bedside, posted several carefully composed images of herself holding her father's hand, and flew back when her own schedule required it, leaving behind a care package and a nurse she had hired, but not briefed properly. Kenna visited regularly, more consistently than his siblings, but he carried into every hospital room the barely concealed anxiety of a man trying to perform the correct version of devoted son while also managing everything in his life that his father's illness was making more difficult. Somi moved in. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or expectation of recognition. She simply began appearing at the hospital before the day nursing shift started and staying past the end of the evening one, filling the gaps that professional care and family obligation between them still left open. She learned the old man's medication schedule better than the hospital staff did. She learned which position was most comfortable for him when his back pain came on in the early afternoon. She brought the specific brand of mint sweets he had been eating for 40 years because they were the only thing that still tasted right to him when the medication dulled everything else. She sat beside him on the bad nights when the pain woke him at 2 in the morning, not saying much, just being present, because she understood by then that what he needed most was not comfort but company. The rest of the family came and went. Somi stayed. There was an evening, 6 months into the illness, when Chief Obi reached out and took her hand in both of his and held it for a long moment without speaking. When he finally did speak, he said only that he had not been wrong about her, and that he was sorry it had taken the rest of them so long to find that out, and that he intended to make sure they did not forget it once he was gone. Somi told him she did not need anything to be done on her behalf. He told her that was exactly why he was going to do it. Chief Emmanuel Obi Sr. died on a Thursday morning in April, peacefully, with Somi beside him. She was the one who called the family, one by one, starting with Kenna. She was the one who stayed at the hospital to complete the paperwork while the family began gathering at the compound. She was the one who organized the caterers for the initial family gathering without being asked, because she understood that grief is easier when the practical things are handled, and she had always been the one who handled the practical things in that family. The burial took place 6 days later, a full Igbo ceremony that drew hundreds of guests and lasted 2 days, the kind of funeral a man of Chief Obi's standing warranted and his family executed with the practiced thoroughness of people who understood the social importance of doing this correctly. Throughout the ceremony, Somi was seated with the general mourners. Not the family section, the general mourners, the same bench as the business associates, the community well-wishers, the people who had known Chief Obi from a comfortable distance and had come to pay their respects with appropriate formality. The distinction was not accidental. It was arranged by Ada with the quiet precision of a woman who understood exactly what statements could be made through seating charts. When the family photograph was taken, no one called Somi's name. She stood just outside the frame and watched Kenna take his place among his siblings, and he glanced at her once and then looked back toward the camera, and she understood in that glance that some things had not changed and were not going to. A cousin of Ada, a woman Somi had met, perhaps twice, leaned toward a neighbor and said, just loudly enough, that it was interesting how some people could spend 2 years at a man's bedside and still not quite be family. Her neighbor agreed that blood was blood and that no amount of bedside manner changed that simple fact. Somi heard both sentences clearly. She was standing near enough. She had always been standing near enough to hear exactly what this family thought of her. She folded her hands and looked ahead and said nothing, exactly as she had done for 11 years. 3 days after the burial, a letter arrived at the Obi compound from the law firm of Agbo, DK and Associates, requesting the attendance of all immediate family members, including by name the wife of Kenna, Somi, at a reading of Chief Emmanuel Obi's will on the following Tuesday at 11 in the morning. The specific inclusion of Somi's name produced, in the compound, the particular kind of silence that follows a detail no one knows quite how to interpret yet. Dubem mentioned that the old man had always had a soft spot for her. His wife said that sentimentality and a will were 2 different things. Chisom, calling from London, said she was certain whatever was in it was perfectly proportionate and there was no need for anyone to overreact before the reading. Nobody said anything directly to Somi about the letter. On Tuesday morning, 43 family members assembled in the main sitting room of the Obi compound, arranged in layers of seating that reflected, as always, the family's internal hierarchy. Somi was offered the last chair in the room, near the back wall, by a cousin who did not meet her eyes while doing it. She took it without comment. The lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Agbo, arranged his papers with deliberate unhurriedness. He asked whether all immediate family members were present. He was told yes. He looked at his list. He asked specifically whether Somi was in the room. The room turned to look at her. She said she was there. He told her Chief Obi had been very specific about that. The will was not complicated. Chief Obi had always been a direct man who distrusted documents that required more words than the thing they were saying actually needed. What it said, in the careful legal language that nonetheless managed to carry something of the man himself in its plainness, was this. To his eldest son Dubem, a residential property in Gara, Enugu, and a 20% share in the construction company. To his daughter Chisom, a commercial property in Lagos, and another 20% share. To his youngest son Kenna, a 20% share, and the family car fleet. The remaining 40% share in the Obi Construction Company, the original family compound and all land attached to it, and the entirety of the late chief's personal savings account was left to Somi on the condition that she maintain her residence in Enugu and manage the compound as she saw fit. Attached to the will was a personal letter, handwritten, which Mr. Agbo read aloud at the specific instruction of the deceased. In it, Chief Obi wrote that he had watched his children inherit his name and his business and had been proud of them. He had also watched a young woman enter his family with nothing but her character and be treated for 11 years, as though character were the least valuable thing a person could bring. He was correcting this, he wrote, not to punish his children, but because a man who has spent 40 years building something real understands, by the end, that the person who actually showed up was always worth more than the people who simply arrived. The room was completely silent by the time Mr. Agbo folded the letter. The silence lasted considerably longer than silences usually do in a room full of Igbo relatives. Dubem was the first to move, setting down his glass of water with a care that suggested he was focusing on the glass specifically to avoid focusing on anything else. His wife looked at a point on the wall. Chisom's voice, crackling through a phone speaker someone had propped on a side table so she could attend remotely, said her name twice before someone remembered to respond to her. What none of them said, in that first long silence, was anything directly to Somi. They looked at her, several of them, with expressions that contained a range of things she had no particular interest in cataloging. She looked back, simply and without drama, the way a person looks when they have nothing to apologize for and nothing to prove. Kenna reached across and took her hand. He held it for a long moment. She let him. Because whatever had been imperfect between them across 11 years, she knew that he had loved her, only sometimes less loudly than the situation required, and that this was a smaller failure than many marriages survived. Later, when the room had slowly emptied of people who needed to be somewhere else urgently, Ada approached her in the corridor with the expression of someone who has decided the dignified path forward is a carefully worded graciousness. She told Somi that the family hoped she understood the will was not something any of them had anticipated, and that she hoped there would be no awkwardness between them going forward. Somi looked at her for a moment. She told her, calmly, that she had never in 11 years caused any awkwardness between them, and she did not intend to start now. Then she excused herself to go and speak with Mr. Agbo about the transition documents. Somi did not move the family out of the compound. She had no interest in that kind of gesture, the performative revenge of exclusion that would have answered 11 years of small cruelties with one large one of her own. Instead, she did exactly what Chief Obi's letter had described her as the kind of person who would do. She managed it. She learned the construction company's accounts with the same thoroughness she had brought to the old man's medication schedule. She made decisions without asking Dubem's opinion first, which he found difficult, and without apologizing for making them, which he found more difficult still. She hired a property manager for the Lagos commercial property the old man had left in a state of mild administrative confusion, and within a year the rental income it produced was higher than it had been in the previous 5 years combined. She made no particular announcement about this. The numbers in the quarterly report spoke plainly enough. There was an afternoon, about 8 months after the will, when Ada came to the compound to discuss something she phrased as a family matter, and that turned out to be a request for Somi to sign off on a decision about one of the company's subsidiary contracts, a decision that had previously been made by Dubem alone and now, technically, required Somi's agreement as the majority shareholder. Somi read the contract carefully, asked 3 questions about the terms that Ada was not equipped to answer, and asked for a revised version with the answers included before she would consider signing. She offered tea while the matter was being sorted out. Ada drank the tea. She thanked her. She left with the unsigned contract and something in her face that was not quite the expression she had arrived with. The Obi family continued to be the Obi family. They were not transformed by a will into different people, and Somi had never once expected them to be. What changed was something smaller and more durable, the ground on which every interaction now stood. She had always known who she was inside that family. Now, everyone else did too, in the only language some families actually understand, the language of what a man of consequence chose to protect with the last document he ever signed. At the end of the first year, she drove out to the cemetery on a Thursday morning, the same day of the week he had died, and sat for a while beside the headstone in the way she had once sat beside his hospital bed, quietly, without needing the silence to become something else. She had not needed him to do what he did. She had told him as much, and she had meant it. But sitting there, in the shade of the cemetery's old trees, watching a gardener move slowly along the far row, she allowed herself one private moment of gratitude, not for the money or the company or the compound, but for the simpler thing underneath all of it, that somewhere in the long ordinary years of showing up, a tired old man had looked at her clearly and seen exactly who she was, and had decided that was worth something. She stayed for half an hour. Then she drove back to the compound, where she had work to do, and where she had, finally and completely, every right to be. If you stayed with this story until the end, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.